Well, thank you, everyone. Welcome to this Prairie State Conservation Coalition webinar. As the Prairie State Conservation Coalition is starting to kind of ramp up some of our educational opportunities, we wanted to begin to provide a series of webinars, and you've probably gotten notice about some of those. We're having one on trail building coming up sometime in the near future as well. So just a little advert for that. Keep a lookout for that, those of you who are interested in that. As you're joining us, please go ahead and add your name and your affiliation in the chat. And then during the presentation, if you can also enter your questions in the chat, we'll kind of try and keep track of those as we go along. The format of this is going to be about 20 minutes of presentation, and then we're going to have some breakout rooms for conversation and discussion before we come back together again. So Tonisha Harris is our presenter today, and Tonisha is with the Illinois Environmental Council. So I'm going to be introducing her, and also Stacy Myers from Open Lands is here with us today, and she's going to be kind of tag teaming with Tonisha on presenting this information. So I don't have a lot of information from you, Stacy, but I do know you a little bit, and I know you've been at Open Lands for a while, and you do a lot of their legal work there, and have worked with you a lot in the past. Thank you for that, and thank you for really working on this initiative, which I think is really important. And we've worked together on a lot of different projects, so thank you. So what I do want to introduce Tonisha, because I don't know if many of you know her. She's a little bit newer on the scene than Stacy is. Many of you probably know Stacy. So Tonisha, her current job is she's the Chicagoland Conservation Manager at the Illinois Environmental Council. And she was previously the Clean Energy Programs Director at the IEC. So beginning in September 2019, she has worked on energy, conservation, and with Chicago teams on facilitation, organization, legislative education, and policy development. She's been a busy woman. Tonisha's goal is to create legislative environmental champions and stewards that will advocate for policy that improves green space and conservation job access to all BIPOC communities. Tonisha earned her Bachelor's of Science with honors in environmental science from Loyola University in Chicago. And she's also a Doris Duke Conservation Scholars alumni, and previously worked for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration researching the effects of nutrient loads on the western basin of Lake Erie, and for the Huron River Watershed Council as the communications and field intern. I love that Tonisha puts in her bio that she was awarded her open water scuba dive certification in the Galapagos Islands. First of all, that she's a scuba diver and that she went to the Galapagos. That's so awesome. And also she's one brave lady as she sings karaoke. So kudos to you, as well as more mundane activities such as reading books and playing video games. So we really appreciate, Tonisha, you're taking the time out from your day today to kind of present this information to us. And as people are entering, we're asking you to put your name and affiliation in the chat, and then also put any questions that you have in the chat. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll have time after the presentation to go into breakout groups for some discussion. So with that, Tonisha and Stacy, I'm going to kind of hand it over to you, and thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I guess I think scuba diving was a little bit braver, but thank you. And we are going to jump right into it. We've prepared a presentation for you. Oops, sorry. Is everyone able to see just the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for allowing the Illinois Environmental Council and Open Lands to present about the 30 by 30 initiative and the Illinois 30 by 30 Coalition. I was going to introduce myself, but Carrie just did a really great job, so I'm going to skip that. And I just want to identify that while IEC is a convener and facilitator of the Illinois 30 by 30 Coalition, Stacy Myers is one of our steering committee members. So this is a joint effort, and we're presenting this on behalf of the coalition. All right, so we are going to talk about, oh, I am so sorry. This is the wrong presentation. Give me one moment.
This is Lindsay from IEC, and Tanisha has been working on about 3 or 4 presentations over the last few days for us. So we'll get the right one up, but she's been doing a great job getting them all sorted. We've got a lot of people really interested in 30 by 30. It's awesome that we get to talk to so many folks.
So Tanisha, if you need help, I've got it.
I got it, but thank you.
No problem.
All right. Great. Sorry about that. So just to tell you a little bit more about the Illinois 30 by 30 Coalition, we convened this around the America the Beautiful campaign because we know that collaboration, stakeholder engagement, and community support were vital to achieving our goals and aligning Illinois with the International 30 by 30 campaign. We have a plethora of organizations that are doing great work around conservation. Some of them mentioned here: environmental organizations, outdoor recreation advocates, land trusts, water and land stewards, etc. They're all doing great work, and we have such a uniqueness in the state of Illinois. Not only are we 75% agriculture, but we have state parks. We have different types of ecosystems, from woodlands to prairies. We have native species, and we also have rural, suburban, and urban areas that, you know, when you're thinking about 30 by 30 and conserving 30% of land and water, it's not immediately clear how you achieve all of that in a state like Illinois. So we knew that as we are going toward our shared goal of supporting biodiversity and mitigating climate change, it's necessary to do this type of coalition building work so we can convene all of those stakeholders and make sure that we are aligned with how to get Illinois into the best possible position to achieve 30 by 30. So we are going to talk about 30 by 30, or which is the international campaign. If you're thinking about it just in the US, it is Restoring and Conserving America the Beautiful. And so 30 by 30 is basically protecting 30% of US land and water by 2030. And this will be a conversation on how to achieve that by nature-based solutions. And so before I get into a definition of nature-based solutions, I just want to flag that on the federal level, even the policy level, words like conservation, conserve, preservation, preserve, and maybe even nature-based climate solutions have not been officially defined. And so that is one of the that's an obstacle and something that we need to overcome, is just how do you define these, because that's going to definitely influence how this work is achieved. But we're going to operate off the IUCN definition of nature-based solutions: actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems that protect that biodiversity and combat climate change. So we're using things like conserving, protecting our shorelines, adopting sustainable agricultural practices, cleaning up our rivers and streams. We're using those types of climate solutions to not only protect biodiversity — we are in the 6th mass extinction right now, and it is anthropogenically caused — but also to combat the consequences of climate change, which we are seeing in our day-to-day lives. For example, since 2001, 24 million acres of natural areas have been lost. So that is like a football field of natural land lost every 30 seconds. We are continuing to see a decrease. Right here in Illinois, you've seen some of the consequences of climate change, with all 102 counties in Illinois declaring agriculture disasters in 2019. July 2019 was the hottest summer on the record. We have seen mass flooding. If you're familiar with East Chicago, that is a big problem over there. And it's not getting better. And we have shoreline erosion. So those are some of the ways that we are seeing the impacts of climate change here. But we're also thinking about what does that do to our biodiversity. I know for those of you that know, I used to work at Chicago Wilderness, and there was an effort to protect some of our native species that were here, like the bobolink, like the smooth green snake, like the molted sculpid. Nope, I pronounced that word, but I'm going to keep going. And, we're just thinking about how do we continue to protect natural area that is constantly seeing degradation and environmental threats and human cost threats. So 30 by 30 is an international campaign established by the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. The world needs to conserve or protect 30% land and water. And so Biden's America the Beautiful has adopted that goal and it applied it to voluntary conservation of private lands, but also the expansion of publicly or federally owned lands, and then more marine protected areas. Currently, a large amount of focus on 30 by 30 is in the West. So again, with the Illinois 30 by 30 Coalition, we know that we have to figure out how to put Illinois on the map with this too. We do have a lot of potential to align with 30 by 30. It's just identifying what that is with some of the uniqueness that I identified earlier that comes with being a part of Illinois. And so thankfully, there is a myriad of opportunities to achieve 30 by 30. You can see in this beautiful demographic that are right here in Illinois. Despite being 75% agricultural or working lands, we have a plethora of ecosystems. We have a lot of interest in natural areas. And these ecosystems that exist across the state, along with coalition building, stakeholder engagement, and policy is going to help us achieve these goals. So whether that's thinking of how we create more urban open space, how do we improve our management of our state parks? What do we do about working lands? We have that potential and opportunity right here in Illinois to get the job done. It's just a matter of how. And that's why we need that coalition building. And so we're going to get into first what President Biden rolled out, and then we're going to talk about what the goals of the Illinois 30 by 30 Coalition are. And so Biden has rolled out principles, metrics, and a first focus, and those are 8 principles, I believe 6 goals that they have compiled, and then specific things that exist around them. And I also want to keep in the back of, I want you guys to keep in the back of your mind that this isn't just a metrics-based thing, though that is vitally important. And Stacey's going to get to that when she takes over. But this is also a social cause. So it's not just, this goal isn't just to protect biodiversity, but it's also to correct some injustices that have been seen by communities, like environmental justice communities or marginalized communities throughout the state. Also throughout the country. And so it is a 10-year campaign, though we are hitting 9 years now because the idea is to achieve this by 2030. And some of the themes are abundance. We want to make sure that people have access to clean air and clean water supplies, access to things that you need to live. We also thinking about resiliency. We want to make sure that our natural areas, our ecosystems are able to adapt, adjust, and change, or remain the way they are. So buffer out some of those very negative impacts of climate change, but also other things that are impacting it as we continue thinking about the wildfires or how we continue deforestation, or currently what we use our natural areas in Illinois for. Also, you can think of this theme as having resilient communities because people are just as impacted by climate change as natural areas. So we want to make sure communities are resilient to the impacts of climate change. And accessibility. You guys might have heard, we want to make sure that we're leaving the planet in a better place than what we came here for. I myself as a youth activist, and so a lot of my work has been around that and just being able to see how just how the seasons have changed since I was a child since right now, and how expeditiously that has occurred. So we want to make sure that every child in America and every person can experience the wonders of nature. And so right now, there are 8 principles, a part of America the Beautiful campaign that will guide this work. And the Illinois 30 by 30 has agreed to adopt these principles as well. We also adopted Biden's goals, but we also created 4 more to be more specific to Illinois. And these principles are intended to ensure equity across the board. And along with supporting tribally-led conservation efforts and following the science, that's, got to make sure we're following the science. I want to draw attention to the first one, which is pursue a collaborative and an inclusive approach to conservation. The reason this coalition was created long before these principles came out is because we need to work together to get this work done. It cannot operate in a silo. We cannot follow conservation efforts as they have traditionally occurred. And so the coalition is making that a center point that we are changing the status quo of things to achieve 30 by 30. All right. Oh, and then here we go to the social justice aspect of it. It is centered on people. These goals are to ensure equity, but also social equity, if you want to think of it more so like that, and making sure that it's a better place than what we left it in. And right now, even though there are 309 state parks across Illinois, not everyone has had access to them. It might be a surprise to you, but it was last month that I visited my second forest preserve in 24 years, and I have never been to an Illinois state park despite living here for 24 years. So we want to make sure that communities have equitable access to this. They feel safe, they can enjoy it, they can work from it, they can sustainably utilize the land just as much as more privileged or affluent people can as well. And that also includes how do we handle urban open space, because this can't just happen in the rural or suburban areas. Like we have the city of Chicago, it has millions of people. So we need to make sure that even urban areas, because Illinois will not be alone in this, can have access to open space right there in their community and don't have to travel a country mile to get to it. So I'm going to pass it over to Stacy.
Thanks, Tanisha. So just really briefly, as we blend into the first focused, as Biden set up 8 principles for America the Beautiful, those principles in this first focus are premised upon, as Tanisha said, the 30 by 30 international movement. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity this July, and I'll put the link in chat, came out and codified the 30 by 30 goal by stating that at least 30% of land and sea areas globally are of particular importance for biodiversity, and that we need to maintain that. And also, one thing that I've heard a lot of confusion about, 30 by 30 or America the Beautiful is centered upon biodiversity, which means that the scientists from the UN came up with this, the science to state that we, by 2030, need to preserve 30% of our land and waters to ensure that we don't reach a tipping point of 75%, where we lose so much biodiversity that our food web unravels. And that's really the grounding of the America the Beautiful and the national 30 by 30 movement. Climate change, however, is absolutely essential as far as, very sorry, it's entwined with biodiversity, and the UN report, as well as what you saw released by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change this week, really speaks to how climate change, biodiversity, and pollution are all entwined, and how mitigating for climate change is going to require the same nature-based solutions that we're calling for in the 30 by 30 movement for biodiversity. So you're going to hear a lot about resiliency, and you're going to hear a lot about biodiversity, and they're all basically essentially linked as far as this campaign that Biden is rolling out, as well as globally as how we're considering solutions to what our globe is facing. So first focus for Biden's national plan is to identify areas of priority and focus investment and collaboration. So on top, despite attempts at times to pull things more towards pristine landscapes and a definition of conservation from a long time ago, Biden has recognized the need to conserve nature where there is people. And nature is more than just conservation landscapes that we consider are large landscapes with our high biodiversity, such as Shawnee National Park, Midewin National Tallgrass Prairie. Biden also really underscored the importance of saving parks and other kind of green spaces within urban areas. And in fact, has devoted 40% of federal investments to disadvantaged communities. So that goes towards what Tanisha was saying on that focus on social justice and equitable access, and really trying to have this 30 by 30 movement not only preserve that essential biodiversity, but also to ensure that all of this is done in a way that's equitable and that raises all communities up in the process. The second, support tribally led conservation priorities, is something that's significant in Illinois, as well as to expand collaborative conservation of fish and wildlife habitats and corridors. That is the work of the Biodiversity Recovery Plan, as well as the Green Vision, and many of the other work that we are doing in order to preserve and enhance our network of blue and green. As specifically for the first focus, Biden has been channeling a lot through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to conserve more at-risk species in state wildlife action plans, such as the one we have in Illinois, migratory bird habitat, and support for existing wildlife refuges, and as well as to collaborate on state restoration initiatives. So how we work with IDNR and then how that flows down through communities is important to this first focus. Next slide. In addition, the first focus includes increasing equitable, well-managed, sustainable access for outdoor recreation. So it's not just enough to preserve it, we need to link it to people. Again, it's this people focus, which is so important. We want to incentivize and reward voluntary conservation efforts of fishers, ranchers, farmers, and forest owners. They focused most on USDA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service programs. Of note, this plan a lot focuses on the private actors that we need to cultivate in order to make this a reality, and really doesn't have us in the forefront. And that's mainly because out west, we see a lot of backlash to this, basically saying that this is a land grab. And so on purpose, the first focus in all of America the Beautiful has basically ensured that the message is clear that this is voluntary and that we need to engage the people that own and are in operations of working lands as well as natural lands, so that people and communities are guiding. Last, but certainly not least, there's a focus on economics, on creating jobs by investing in restoration and resilience. This is the American Jobs Plan, as well as the Civilian Climate Corps, which as of 1:30 this morning, I believe, was still part of the reconciliation plan on the Senate side for our infrastructure bill. Next slide. So in addition to this first focus, the administration is really set on measurables in defining metrics for a baseline as well as our progressive success. The first out of the box is the American Conservation and Stewardship Atlas. We need to understand where we're at now nationally. And instead of having a national push that's top down, the 4 agencies that are involved, USDA, Natural Resources Inventory, there's the Forest Inventory and Analysis, NOAA, USGS. Agencies are reaching down into the states and communities to aggregate all of the data that we have to create this atlas. This is, like David Holman, all of the work that you're doing is going to be an essential part of Illinois' baseline. And as the nation moves forward with this, as the agencies move forward, we should think about what information we have that's going to be essential to blend into this atlas. Every year, America the Beautiful is going to release annual updates. It's a progress report by 4 agencies: Department of Interior, Department of Ag, NOAA, and CEQ. And the report's going to include not only metrics on where we're at as far as our progress in protecting land and water, but also on collaboration, which again, Tanisha highlighted in the beginning, that importance of collaboration and cultivating basically the desire to meet our targets through our communities. It will assess land cover changes, including loss of open space, as well as fish and wildlife habitat conditions and populations. Next, please. So what does all of this mean for Illinois? Next slide. Tanisha?
So as I mentioned earlier, we have along with adopting America the Beautiful principles and the goals that Stacy just laid out, we knew that with Illinois being in a unique position in this work, that we needed to adopt some goals that were uniquely specific to Illinois and what we as a coalition want to achieve. So first goal is communities will be thoroughly resourced to lead decision-making in their community. Again, we want this to have community participation, and we want to make sure that as these changes are happening, as we're headed towards 30 by 30, that communities are not only aware of what's going on, but they were a part of the decision-making process, which doesn't happen nearly as often as it should. And if it is happening, it's happening in a way that is still exclusionary. Number two, every Illinois resident has access to healthy, environmental, sustainable, and ethically sourced food, and the rights to produce their own and remain intact. So I don't know if you guys heard of the cottage food bills that just passed. That was a great win on helping achieve some of this goal, but we also wanted to make sure that this is more of a local food option. So your food isn't coming from several miles away, and we're eradicating food deserts as we do it, so everyone can access fresh quality food in their own community and neighborhood. Three, all Illinois communities are resilient to climate change fueled flood impacts through reliance on multi-benefit projects that improve public safety, social equity, biodiversity, water quality, water security, and quality of life. As Stacy mentioned, you're going to hear the word resiliency a lot throughout this presentation, because that is how we're going to help mitigate the impacts of climate change on not only communities, but also ecosystems. But also we heard from our water stewards who are in the coalition that with coupling, the way that Biden couples conservation of land and water, it kind of makes it where water is a little bit minimized. So we pulled out a water goal to make sure it's getting the attention it needs. And then our last one is our sustainable ag goal. Illinois-based farm operators have the information and resources to deploy holistic farming practices that improve soil and water quality, while also maintaining the economic well-being of the rural farm community. So the rural farm community is changing. There's a lot of women, there's a lot of young farmers. We're trying to increase the amount of Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers. So while we want to make sure that they're using sustainable agricultural practices, and as we're thinking about the nutrient loss reduction strategy and how we're going to implement that, we want to make sure that the spirit and the culture of farming is also being maintained and is something that you can make a viable living on.
Thank you, Tanisha. So where we're going to shift to now is we can see how the Illinois 30 by 30 Coalition has basically tried to develop what Biden's goals, principles mean in Illinois. I think to take a step back now, we want to look at where we are at now. What is our baseline? Where are we starting? So David Holman, thank you so much for all of these statistics. We've thrown in a couple of our own, but they're largely David's, so we appreciate your help. Over 36 million acres of land and water in Illinois, with only 1.48 million acres of land publicly and privately protected as natural land. That's 4.1% of our total acreage in Illinois. In the last 5 years, we've protected, as far as we know from iView through PSCC, about 27,000 acres of natural land or restorable agricultural land. And David could probably update that statistic for us. We are looking as an example of what it takes financially in order to meet our goals. Acquiring 10,000 acres in Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge costs about $100 million. And that's based on our actual costs to date of preserving about 1,000 acres. 75% of Illinois land is in agriculture. That's 27 million acres. In 2019, CREP's high value continuous sign-up contracts were about 594,000 acres. So if you add in all of the work we've done through CREP, which is about 2.3% of Illinois' landmass, and then you look at everything that we've done over the years to protect public and private natural lands at 4.1%, it gets us to about 6.4% of Illinois land. So if that were to change, and we were to actually have 30% literally apply to natural lands, that would mean that we would need an additional 10.9 million acres across the state. That's about the size of New Jersey. To get from 4.1 to 5% in Illinois, it would take conserving over 420,000 acres. That's about the size of a Shawnee National Forest and Tumadewan National Tallgrass Prairies. If you were to look at conservation easements over that expanse, if you're assuming 30% of $8,000 per acre for all the land trusts out there, it would cost near about $1.7 billion just to get us to 5% with the models and the function that we are at right now. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is issuing per year $900 million to protect land in 50 states. We are one of 50, and that's competitive. Local referendum in just the 7-county Chicagoland area could generate about 175 million. That'll protect about 7,000 acres in 5 years. Now, we do have the blessing of over 23 million acres of cropland, which offer greater opportunities for regenerative practices, which help. And we know that maintenance and green jobs are going to be vital to keep what we protect. Next slide. Tanisha, if you could move it forward one, that'd be great. Thank you. So what we really are looking at here is a supply and a demand problem. In its simplest state, what is 30 by 30? To figure out what it means to our state, we have to figure out what can we bring to the table? What is our capacity? What can our capacity be if we scale up? How do we enable local communities, the state, the other government agencies and the federal level to help us scale up here? And then how do we get funding and the people to do all of that work? So that's the supply side. That's what we bring. On the demand side, what can we get? You know, unfortunately, even if we had billions of dollars dumped into our lap, unless our models and our cultivation unlocks opportunities for mass scale conservation, we're still going to be stuck. So how do we refine how we cultivate? How do we reach the masses? Because enough people must be willing to protect and steward land and waters at scale for this to work. Next slide. So we also need to be cognizant of the role of planning and protections, and that we are not moving in a straight line. And as we move forward, as we scale up, we need to prevent losses to farmland, biodiversity, and functional open space, both in built communities as well as those that are more rural. And Tanisha cited to a couple of things on here, but one thing that I found stunning, if you look at building all of the cores of the Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge, the first bi-state metropolitan wildlife refuge in the United States, it would be erased as far as acreage progress by North Point Intermodal Facility and Piatone Airport up in northeastern Illinois. So 10,000 to 10,000. So planning matters, protections matter as we move forward with conservation. And comprehensive planning that CMAP does and others do on the local, state, and federal level are going to be integral to our how we operate in the future. Next slide. So aligning the alliances in all of this, as we speak with you today, is critical to define, to innovate, and to succeed. On the Land Trust Alliance, to speak of aligning with alliances, right now has put out many calls to action to catalyze a dramatic increase in private land protection to achieve 30 by 30 by pledging to conserve 60 million acres. So those of us that are a part of Land Trust Alliance, they have rolled out basically a map as to how they see land trusts being able to be mobilized and collaborate on achieving the private as well as the public conservation goals that Biden has laid out. LTA has put out, as all of us look at the map and we look at our acreage and we look at what this takes, this is achievable. We can actually do this. And LTA has basically said, though, to succeed, we must sustain working lands and create a conservation network of climate resilient sites. We have to blanket the nation and not carve out holes. That means we need to put Illinois on the map as part of the mosaic and the fabric of 30 by 30 across the nation. And what it basically put out as what land trusts need to help our nation succeed are 4 things. Increase federal funding and support for land trusts and private landowners. That can include tax credits. Mobilize a new power base that prioritizes conservation as essential to people's well-being. Address inequities in conservation and advance community conservation for health and public access, and develop new capacity for conservation. Next slide.
So how do we achieve that? And someone asked in the chat, how do we achieve biodiversity with the goals that have been laid out? Well, the first step is having a robust coalition that is already doing this work and making sure that we are convening together and filling in those capacity needs, those expert needs, and really getting together to answer this question: how do we achieve such a large, robust, and ambitious effort like 30 by 30? And so we have some of the organizations working together. We hope that Prairie State Conservation Coalition will consider joining us in this. But thinking about community-led conservation, agriculture organizations, big already established coalitions like Prairie State Conservation Coalition or Chicago Wilderness and Land Trust Alliance, and the organizations like IEC bringing in that policy and advocacy, we're all joining together for Illinois 30 by 30 Coalition to achieve whatever it is we decide to lay out and figure out how do we tackle this.
So what does success look like? After we've heard what LTA has said, after we've looked at Biden's initiative, it really boils down to 5 questions that we see. And then we want to open up dialogue as to what you see and how you feel there are challenges and opportunities for our land trust community in Illinois to contribute. So how can we move the masses and decision makers to care and act to hit and maintain our 30 by 30 target? How can we leverage government resources to attract federal and private funds to scale up our capacity and our impact? How can we better assist underserved communities achieve their needs and vision, building resiliency and equitable access to healthy lands and waters? And how can we expand our models with agencies, organizations, communities, and institutions to accelerate the speed and scale of conservation? And last, how do we define our own baseline and attainable metrics based on supply and demand for conservation?
Yeah, so we have already brainstormed some ways that the PSCC can help us get involved, but we originally planned breakout rooms. And Stacy, I'm wondering, with the 19 minutes we have left, if we think this group can just do a large group discussion instead, or what do you think, real quick?
I think that we could probably do that, with the exception that we would absolutely love people to participate both in chat as well as to popcorn. We're going to have questions that we pose, and any of the questions that appeal to you, please answer.
Yes.
So we can have dialogue on those points.
I'm happy to help moderate the chat too while you guys are facilitating on screen.
Thank you. And then if you can take notes during this portion, that would be immensely helpful. So these are some of the ways we think PSCC can engage. You know, one, as serving as the voice of land trust across Illinois, we definitely need to hear from you guys as we're going about the coalition work. And I just want to say, in 2022, we are expecting to write a bill and introduce it in front of the General Assembly. So that is one way we are going to achieve this. And we need to hear from we need to have it as robust stakeholder engagement, as many voices at the table as possible. And that includes land trusts, an intimate understanding of constraints and barriers to these goals. So again, with this being already a conglomeration of land trusts, we want to hear, like, what are your biggest barriers? What are your constraints? What is, like, in an ideal world would you want to see? And we're going to get into that in our discussion a little bit. Also bringing more capacity and resourcing. We are struggling to get more community organizations involved because, to be honest, not everyone is funded to do this work. And so where we can have larger organizations and coalitions fill in that capacity gap would be immensely helpful. Helping us network with larger nationwide organizations. We did attend a few big tent calls, hearing about what other states are doing, what are the barriers they're encountering, what are some of the successes they're seeing. Again, defining just what conservation and preservation means is a really big obstacle right now, and it's not unique to Illinois. And then also being a focus group audience, which we are slightly not really giving you an option in, because we're going to do that right now. We were going to do breakout rooms, but we ran a little bit over with our presentation. So we're going to have this large group discussion. We're hoping, since, you know, everyone knows each other, we can get some dialogue going, as Stacy said. Please feel free to operate in the chat, to come off mute, or put your name in the stack. These are the questions that we're going to go through. How do we retool our conservation models used by government and land trusts to preserve land faster and take a more equitable approach? How do we work better with communities to cultivate opportunities in time to meet the 2030 goal? Funding. What does funding look like? How do you operate at 100% capacity? We know that's going to be a big one. If we can achieve cultivating adequate opportunities, what would we need to then meet that demand? And what are the greatest barriers to scaling up conservation in Illinois? All right, so feel free to answer any of these questions. And we do hope that you'll join us again for another discussion to continue this and really do a deep dive into that funding piece. So would anyone like to get on the stack or put a response to a question in the chat? Let's open it up.
Just real quick, we're also going to do a deep dive on models. For those of you that I'm pulling that together, and hopefully we'll be facilitating something on that topic within the near future, so that we have an opportunity for those of us that are actually in the nuts and bolts to look at how we can go faster. But preliminary thoughts are very welcome today as to how we think we can retool as one of the 5 questions.
So Stacy and Tanisha, this is Carrie Lee. One of the things that I'm looking at in terms of barriers is not only the funding, but also the capacity to manage the land. And that's something that we've been working on for several years with our working lands model, to bring farms as habitat is kind of the tagline for us. But using income from farms to begin to start managing our preserves. But when we're talking about preserving land, each time we acquire something, or a state or a county organization acquires something in terms of preservation and acquisition, we have to think, how are we going to manage this? So that's a big thing. I know all of the agencies across the state of Illinois, whether they're NGOs or government agencies, are grappling with that issue of managing the land and feeling that it's almost irresponsible to take on things that you can't manage. So that's a huge barrier. So one of the things that we are looking to do, of course, conservation land trusts, PSCC members do conservation easements, as does the C2000 with the DNR. They did conservation easements. And we know that a lot of land that needs protected in the state is owned by private landowners. So we're also working a lot with agricultural conservation easements. And of course, these big new PSCC Farm Bill programs allow, there's a couple people on the call here who are part of those. And those agricultural conservation easements, we can write into our leases and make them even more stringent on how into the easement and into the leases on the conservation practices. But I would say, to me, that's the biggest barrier is capacity to manage and funding for acquisition. And a lot of people, a lot of foundations will fund the acquisition of something, but they're not so happy funding conservation easements, for example, which is private land. So there you go.
Thank you. That's something that came up. We've had a few policy discussions, and we've discussed this at some length and during our table meetings. I just want to say Dave also brought up the cost of land or the value of the land, and then also financial incentives for private conservation. That is also a barrier that has come up before, but it's good to hear it again. So thank you both, Carrie and Dave, for raising that.
What about cultivating demand? Reaching people, reaching more people in order to move them towards, because Carrie is and I'm singling you out because you just spoke, but we know that even if we had $1 billion dropped on our lap right now to spend within the next year, if we don't have cultivation scale up with our capacity and our funding, how do we move, right? So how are we scaling up? What are the ideas to cultivate greater demand?
I think Bob McKeer had a good comment about relating to that breaking down the silos.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one way of doing that, scaling up and bringing people together.
Yeah.
This idea of alignment's been around for a long time. I mean, speaking from my heart, I'm not sure it ever got a lot of traction. Perhaps we either don't want to do it or we don't know how to do it. I like to think the latter. But I think it does get to the question that Stacy posed. I think one of the ways we can build cultivation is let people who are really good at that do it. And we need to find out who they are. They may not be in our community, if you are, our conservation community. They may be somewhere else. But I just, this whole issue of alignment, I think is a critical one once again.
Hey, Tanisha, I was going to suggest, feel free to answer on your own too, but I was going to suggest maybe quickly talking a little bit about the Clean Jobs Coalition and how IAC worked to convene those folks and align them and the variety of stakeholders who had really sort of been in the opposite of alignment, and then some of the success that you've had. If you can do that quickly, I know it's a big topic, but I know that that's what we're hoping to base this work off of a little bit.
Yeah, so the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition really did the groundwork and a lot of grassroots organizing to get the necessary stakeholders at the table to discuss a clean energy bill. And so right now, the ICJC has 200 organizations ranging from private business sector, environmental organizations, big green organizations, and community organizations. But along with that, it did this series of Listen, Lead, Share events, which IEC is modeling right now, which are community listening sessions. So they had a Listen, Lead, Share event in every 59 Senate district across the state in 2018, I want to say. And so that was basically going into communities and asking them, essentially what we're asking you, what are the biggest barriers? How do you feel about this? How can we make this happen? While also making sure that data was compiled compiled and analyzed, it was given to the necessary people who could do that. And so as Bob was saying, maybe we don't have those cultivators in the conservation space. I think we do. It's just that who's funded to do that work? And again, that's another problem the coalition is having. We need to have those organizations here because they are great at convening their communities and they know what their communities need, but they can't necessarily get a seat at the table. And the Illinois 30 by 30 Coalition is hoping to change that. So we have 8 minutes left. Any other comments or questions? Would anyone else like to answer these? I apologize, we didn't have time for breakouts. Okay, it looks like there is a comment in here. I believe farmers are reluctant to be the first in their area to change their tilling practices and to begin using cover crops. Maybe the FSA offices can identify key farmers who are willing to be leaders and encourage them to lead the way. So that is a really great point. I've learned in my short time here doing a little bit of ag work that it's a lot of education and changing the traditional way of doing things, not necessarily figuring out what the solutions are. We have the solutions. We have NLRS and we have the Illinois Wildlife Action Plan, and we know that we need to change our farming practices, but how do we convince farmers to do that? And I think that is, oh, go ahead, Lindsay.
I was just going to say that in the coalition, we have some really great organizations who make this their mission. So American Farmland Trust, the Illinois Stewardship Alliance use these really great different tactics. They have a soil health caucus of farmers who are early adopters and are leaders and help folks become later adopters. And American Farmland Trust does a lot of training and research, and so I think we have those folks in our community with some really creative takes on how to get to that.
Also, there are a lot more incentives at the moment. So the state of Illinois had a cover crop thing where they were doing some cost share, and they had a lot of money in there, and it was sold out in one day. So they're going to be continuing that program, and they have other programs too. And like I said, the Farm Bill encouraging the agricultural easements with their conservation practices, and the STAR program, the Illinois STAR program that's been rolled out for farmers. A lot of them are taking advantage of that. So there's a huge initiative now. I'm seeing a huge shift from just 5 years ago in the agricultural community, with people paying attention to their bottom line and seeing that when they're losing water or when their soil is eroding or all of those things, that they're losing money. So I do think things are shifting and changing, and more farmers are taking advantage of this.
Yeah, Carrie, to your point, I mean, if you look at King County and the agricultural easement program that they started some time ago with Janice Hill, by word of mouth, Dave, to your point, of farmers, the wait list is now so long, and the riverboat money is not nearly enough to be able to sign everybody up, right? So that goes, Carrie, to your point, is funding capacity as well as maintenance being so key. But I'm wondering if we could scale up these programs, if we did receive federal funding, how could what would we need to retool as far as our capacity in order to do this? Because if we're serious about gearing up, what does that look like?
I'm going to jump in here, Ken, because any kind of federal funding requires a lot of hoops and a lot of work to do. And a lot of smaller conservation land trusts within the PSCC don't have that capacity. So when we partner with other organizations, when we collaborate, for example, working with American Farmland Trust, we have this statewide PSCC initiative. They're doing a lot of that. We partnered with Trout Unlimited for another PSCC, ag easements in Northwest Illinois. So when we can partner with these other organizations who then take over the onerous reporting of some of this federal money, that's a big help.
Yeah, and since we're on a topic of funding, and I'd love to hear from some people who haven't spoken yet. What would funding look like for your organization to operate 100% capacity? Feel free to also respond to that in the chat if you'd prefer.
There is a wealth of knowledge in this room.
Bob, I'm wondering if you can expand more on a suspension of government red tape.
Well, I guess it's a hopeful wish and dream, but you know, the challenge that's been laid down is both a scope of work, 30% of our lands and waters, with a deadline, and so that makes it a project. And when you have a project that has a deadline, a whole bunch of stuff has to align to make that happen. And I think one of the huge impediments that we all see, just even in the chat, is that it takes too long to do anything. And why? I guess I understand the bureaucracy to make sure everything is perfect and you know, all the I's are dotted and T's crossed. But in a way, there needs to be a suspension of perfection. We need to make this happen. And I think it not only requires the technical expertise of on-the-ground workers and people who can cultivate and farmers who want to do this and can be brought on board, but you can't lay out a project and not have the supporting mechanisms that make it able to happen. And so I think there has to be a lot of, lobbying, legislative work to sort of peel away the bureaucracy so that we can actually achieve this. I've never seen so much enthusiasm to do something, and we still are faced with the same impediments.
Thank you, Bob, for clarifying that. I would agree, and I also see there's some more discussion happening in the chat. As we come up to our last minute, I want to reiterate that we we had this last question. So, like, what does Prairie State Conservation Coalition need to make this happen? Basically, what do you guys need to join our coalition so we can continue to have these discussions? And we can continue to collaborate and break down silos and figure out what funding looks like. And knowing that's probably an unfair question to ask at the top of the hour. And you know, these are complicated questions. So we hope that you will join us again to have a deeper dive into these questions about models and funding, and also just join the coalition or serve as a steering committee member too, so we can start thinking about these solutions and how do we get them through a policy package. Any final questions or comments?
Thank you both, Tanisha and Stacy. And I think, you know, the PSCC board is going to probably have further discussions on this. And I know that we do want to be a part of this initiative, what that might look like. We can make those decisions internally, but thank you very much for providing the background for all of this. And we look forward to working with you on taking a deeper dive into some of these really important questions that have been brought up today, like, you know, how do some of these things really work to protect more habitat? What does that mean? And how can we address some of these barriers that we've been talking about and get things moving through red tape? So thank you so much.